So, a very warm welcome to everyone tonight. Thanks so much for coming along to this special An Taisce webinar exploring ponds for nature conservation. Thanks also to so many of our amazing An Taisce members who could join us this evening. We're very happy to be joined by others who may not be members yet, but we would love if you would consider becoming one. An Taisce is the National Trust for Ireland and was founded in 1948. Our mission is to protect and celebrate the nation's natural and built heritage. And we're delighted that our webinar speaker this evening is Aoife O'Rourke. Just to introduce her a little bit, she's a conservation ecologist, a pond expert and contributing author of An Taisce's wonderful and practical set of pond resources, including the Irish Pond Manual, Ponds, a Guide for Local Authorities, and Aoife was the project lead for the Ponds for Biodiversity strand of An Taisce's EU Life-funded Legacy for Life project. Aoife is also the founder of True Nature Ecology and a strong believer in collaborative conservation and community-based conservation. Her current work centers around land management and monitoring guidance, providing specialist talks and workshops and development of outreach, communications, and educational resources. After the talk, there'll be time for a Q&A, and you can jot the questions into the chat as she speaks if you like, or the Q&A box so they can be answered at the end. The recording of this webinar will be shared with you along with the links mentioned in the talk afterwards via the email that you've registered on Eventbrite to get your tickets. So without further ado, I'll just hand you over to Aoife so she can get going.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for that very grand introduction, and welcome to everybody here tonight. And thank you so much for coming out to watch this webinar, especially when the weather is absolutely fantastic outside. So yes, as Valerie was saying, over the past few years, I've developed a really special interest in ponds, personally and professionally. And I could talk about them for weeks, but I know we only have an hour here tonight, so I'll do what I can, and I'll give you a little whistle-stop tour of the things that I've learned about ponds over the past few years. Now, oops, sorry. So the rough outline of the talk is as follows. We're going to talk about what ponds are, how they're defined, why they're so important for wildlife and for human health, and also climate change mitigation, what makes them good for wildlife and climate change mitigation, the threats that they are under, how to create ponds and manage them, specifically and particularly for wildlife. And then I'll run through a few examples of different ponds and case studies. We'll also touch on health and safety because that can be a really big barrier to creating ponds for a lot of people. We'll also have a little look about supports, some of the supports in Ireland and further afield for creating, managing and restoring ponds. And then monitoring ponds for wildlife, because after you've done all that hard work, if you're going to create a pond or if you're going to restore it, it's good to know what's happening and how things change and monitor your wildlife after that. So just to begin there, ponds are bodies of water. They're particularly small bodies of water, usually freshwater, but occasionally they can be brackish, so a bit salty, such as sand dunes, dune slacks. They can vary in size from very small, between 1 meter squared, all the way up to 2 hectares in size, which is about equivalent to 2.5 football pitches. And they hold water for 4 months of the year or more. So that's a permanent pond, and that's how that's defined. But we also have temporary or ephemeral ponds, and these can hold water for less than 4 months of the year. So they tend to have occasional droughts, and this can be particularly good for wildlife because the occasional drought gets rid of predators, bigger predators like fish, which are major predators of insects and amphibian larvae, and allows other species to thrive, particularly rarer species. So many ponds that have been created by people, but there are plenty of examples of ponds made by nature. These include those that have been made by meandering rivers, eroding glaciers, or even by a tree falling and leaving the root pit exposed. So there are absolutely fantastic habitats, which we're going to have a look at now. And like I said, they come in all shapes and sizes, which is it's fantastic. It means that they're very accessible as a habitat for most people. So why are they so important? Well, they're really high in nature value. So freshwaters occupy less than 1% of the earth, yet they support a huge 10% of all known species. And that's phenomenal when you think about it. And we need to do everything that we can to protect them. Ponds, despite being very small, are a really important part of these systems. And I guess they have long been the underdog. And who doesn't love an underdog, especially us Irish, I think sometimes. So I think ponds, they pack more a lot more, they pack a lot into them and they punch above their weight. So that's one of the reasons why they're so important. Um, they help us tackle big environmental issues that affect us all, like climate change, flooding, pollution, and like I said, they're fantastic for biodiversity. They can support an extraordinary 2/3 of all freshwater species, and creating clean freshwater ponds is one of the best ways and simplest ways and most effective ways to protect freshwater wildlife and actually wider wildlife, even terrestrial wildlife. They are also so important for human physical, mental, and social well-being. So this is something that we all need. We all need to be connected to nature. We, from children right up to the oldest people you can imagine. So it's just, I think, even in terms of the physical side of things, if you're going to create a pond, whether it be in your garden or if you're going to do it as part of a community group, there's the physical aspect of that, like actually carrying out that work. There's also then the mental wellness. So there's that sense of reflection, and that ponds and water features are often a place where people come around and aggregate as communities. There's the leisure side of things. There's just a lot of connection, and then viewing nature and enjoyment and recreation, and all these different things are hugely important for all of us. So today, 2/3 of all freshwater species can be found in ponds, like I was saying. So here are a few of the different species that you can find in ponds. So in Ireland, so we've got our common frog over here. Actually, can you see me pointing? You probably can't. So anyway, the top left corner, you can see our common frog. Then you've got all kinds of wonderful vegetation, like water forget-me-not. We've got our smooth newt, which is the only native newt and only native amphibian with a tail in Ireland. Otters even frequent ponds, and especially if ponds are close to other wetland features, you find that otters are very good at getting through the landscape, especially where there's ditches and riparian areas around rivers and streams, and then you've got your ponds. And certainly in the springtime, when there's a lot of activity with our frogs, when they're mating, you often find otters in larger ponds and on smaller ones having a feast on those frogs. They're fantastic for a whole range of different bat species, because these bats, of course, feed on insects, and ponds are a fantastic place for insects. So we've got our macroinvertebrates, which is the invertebrates without a backbone that live underneath the water, that you can see with your eyes. They're large enough to see. And then you've got the adult versions of those, which there's so many different varieties of insects that you will find around a pond. So this picture down here of this bat is our water bat, Daubenton's bat. And this bat is particularly interesting because it can even glean insects off the surface of the water. It's got specially adapted kind of flaps around its feet. And then even when it comes to our different bird species, there's a lot that would be associated with wetlands. And for example, our beautiful swallow here, they both feed over ponds and around ponds because, again, there's a huge wealth of insects that tend to be around ponds. But they also will use, if there's clay around the pond, they'll use that to make their nests. There's a nice picture here of a grey wagtail, and on the bottom right, this is a beautiful species that's very much associated with water as well. And if you're lucky enough to be in Wicklow or to visit Wicklow, Kilmacurra is a good place to see this bird around the pond, the ornamental pond down there. It's part of the Botanic Gardens, and I've often seen the female feasting on damselflies. and bringing it back to the nest in one of the nearby trees. And then we've got a whole range of different, like I said, different insects, like this beautiful blue damselfly here. And then in terms of ecosystem services, so ecosystem services, it's a difficult, I find it difficult talking about that. It's very much human centric. What does wildlife do for me? But we'll use it here anyway, knowing its limitations. So for example, ponds can be really good at storing carbon. So they have been shown to store 20 to 30 times more carbon than woodlands and grasslands, other habitats like that. They're great for water purification and also for flood regulation. So ponds help to slow water through the landscape. Um, Again, they're biodiversity hotspots and support rare species as well as or more common species. And they also act as nature-based solutions to climate change by storing water, like I said, in the landscape and regulating climate. Again, we can't underestimate the wellness impact that water and ponds have on people. And I think one of the things that I noticed when I was working last year as part of the Refarm team, which I'll tell you a little bit about later, it was working with farmers and specifically in Wicklow. I was managing the Wicklow portion of it, and farmers that were creating ponds on their land, clean freshwater ponds for wildlife. And the words that kept coming up were how well they felt, how good the pond made them feel, and how proud that they felt. So it's just really, really important, these kind of things. In terms of carbon storage, permanent and naturally vegetated ponds are the best at storing carbon. And Taylor et al., these researchers found that small ponds sequester, like I said, the 20 to 30 times more carbon than the woodlands, grasslands, and other habitats. And you can see here in the image here of wetlands. Wetlands are fantastic at storing carbon in their sediments and in the plant cover as well. And they're absolutely fantastic as resources for education for all ages. They provide a natural outdoor classroom and an exciting opportunity for all ages to interact and get close to a variety of wildlife. So here's an image of my friend Cody and his then 2-year-old Derek. So you can start kids early with ponds, and there's plenty of safe ways to get involved with ponds in terms of the education and pond dipping and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of threats to ponds, pollution is probably the greatest threat to most ponds. And pollution, there's lots of different sources of pollution, of course, but the two kind of main sources would be runoff from agricultural land, so where there's a lot of inputs of nitrates and phosphates and things like that. And then road surfaces as well. So the runoff, the water that runs off of road surfaces that can get into ponds, that can have a lot of microplastics and petrochemicals, things like that. And then what happens when a pond becomes eutrophied is that the oxygen levels plummet, which is no good for an awful lot of animals and plants. And then you tend to get these flushes of algae, which can, again, kind of shade out other species below. So that can provide issues, various different issues. Other threats to ponds are infilling. So infilling can happen naturally if it's a woodland pond, or if it's been encroached by woodland, so that the leaf litter will then start to build up and start to dry out or fill in that pond. And of course, there's been plenty of occasions where people have deliberately filled in ponds because they didn't realize the value of ponds at the time, and they wanted to have maybe more land for housing or more land for agriculture and things like that. Then there's drainage. Drainage has been a large issue in Ireland over the years. And I think over the past 100 years, we've lost about 50% of our amphibian breeding ponds due to drainage. Now, this is something that happened I think mostly due to agricultural intensification. So that the pressure was put on the land, and it's certainly not the farmers' fault. The farmers were were told this is what we need to do. We need more food, and the pressure, the consumerist pressure was on them as well. So it's just one of those societal issues that we've had to deal with, and it's something that I think we're trying to amend in different ways at the moment. Another threat to ponds is climate change directly. So indirectly, through things like warming waters. So that you'll have species that aren't tolerant to that warming. And then the extended dry periods, even for these ephemeral or temporary ponds, if the dry period goes on too long, that's not going to be good, even for the rarer species that are quite tolerant to drying. So some species, what they can do is in the dry period, they can encapsulate. They can kind of put a capsule, kind of barrier around themselves, and they can survive in that substrate until there is more water, and then they can reproduce again. But if the period of drying is too prolonged, that's going to cause an issue even for those rarer species. Another key threat to ponds is alien non-native invasive species. And there's a whole range of these, unfortunately, that we have to deal with. And I've just given a couple of examples here. And I think the main way they've really got into our pond and wetland ecosystems has been through the aquarium trade and the horticulture trade. So a lot of these plants would have been sold and still are sold in aquariums and horticultural centres as oxygenating plants or plants to have in with your aquarium and all that side of things. So here are a few examples. So the top example there is African curly waterweed. And this species is native to southern Africa and was first reported in Ireland in the wild in 1966. And there's been populations in Lough Corrib and places like that. That was one of the species that was introduced as an oxygenating plant. And it has this green color. And what it can do is it can actually clog waterways. So even for recreation, it's a real issue there. It can outcompete and shade out lots of other different native species. And it can actually reach the full depth of the water column. So it can be a really big issue. Another one, kind of a smaller species here, but not much of a smaller issue, is Azolla, which is the water fern. So it's this tiny little fern, and it looks, if you see just a small amount of it, it looks quite attractive, which is probably how it got here. So it's a species of native to north to Central America. It was first recorded in Ireland in about 1900s. It's a tiny floating fern, but it creates these mats, and again, it starts to block out the light and outcompete other species. And the thing about a lot of these non-native invasive species is that they don't necessarily have to reproduce through seeds or anything like that. They can actually reproduce vegetatively, which means that even if little tiny parts of them come off, then they can reproduce themselves. That's another issue with those kind of species. And with the water fern, it can become an issue where it just creates these big mats, as I was saying, and then it can cause issues with water-based recreation and that side of things as well. Then we've got species such as the pond sliders. So pond sliders are a type of turtle, and there's different species like the red-eared pond slider and the yellow-bellied pond slider, and they were introduced. First of all, they were pets, but then of course people sometimes get fed up with these pets and then just put them into the local water body, which often can be a pond. So these can cause a lot of issues, particularly with ground nesting birds. So they can prey they can also prey on fish, but the chicks of certain ground nesting birds would be susceptible to this species. So there's a lot of different species to look out for, and you can have a look here at invasives.ie. And I'll tell you a little bit of another place that we have a lot of information on that as we move along in a few minutes. So I know that's doom and gloom there, but there's a very big good news portion to this, which is what we all need, don't we? So I'll talk about a few things that we can do in order to conserve these amazing habitats and help them flourish. So the great thing about ponds is, like I said, they come in all different shapes and sizes. There's a pond for every situation, I would say. Even if you have a balcony, you can have a pond. There's mini or micro ponds that are just made out of containers, such as buckets. You can see here on the left, this is a really tiny little pond, and there's even vegetation in that pond. I think I can see it's fool's watercress. And then in the next pond in the middle, that was made out of an old barrel. And you can see my daughter Maeve having a peer in there. And these are actually a few of the different mini ponds at my good friend's nature reserve, Brian and Gilly's nature reserve down in Wild Acres in Scratton in County Wicklow. So they have this barrel here, and what they even have in here is like bog bean. So it's amazing what can thrive in there. And also you can see Brian here. He's showing off another tiny little pond here. And what surprised me at the time was seeing these big bulrushes in here. So bulrushes they're native, but they can kind of become what am I trying to say? They can really spread very quickly, even in large ponds. But of course, if you've got a small pond, of course that's fine, because you could manually take them out if you want. So something that you don't usually see maybe in a small pond, but it works very nicely. And I'll just say a little something about here. Just behind Brian, you'll see the log piles here. I'll be talking a little bit about those later, but they can be really important in terms of bringing in more species to ponds, and they can sometimes act as little hibernacula, like little places for newts and frogs to hibernate, a whole range of different species of insects, especially the species that are saprophilic, which means that they like to feed on rotting wood, or they have their larvae living in them. But anyway, that's just an aside while we're on that slide. Here are some other mini or micro ponds. So this one on the left again is from Wild Acres, because I use a lot of the examples from Wild Acres because they now have 67 ponds that they've created, which is absolutely phenomenal. This little pond, you can see that if you can just look at the water in the one on the left, you can see broad-leaved pondweed on the top. So these kind of water plants, these aquatic plants, are really important for all kinds of wildlife. But for instance, the floating kind of vegetation can be really good for smooth newts, because they like to fold the leaves over once they lay their eggs in there. And then the little really micro pond on the right is in my own garden. This is my horticultural section of my garden, so there are some horticultural plants in there, but there's lots of wild plants as well. You can see ribwort plantain and various grasses and all the rest. So this is a micro pond that Gobnet O'Neill has designed. So she had these they're just buckets, like the old buckets from, I think they were from Dunn's, where people had been holding flowers like bouquets and stuff in, and they're going to waste. So she took a whole host of them, and she was giving them out. So she designs these like little micro ponds, just so that anybody, really, almost anybody, can have a pond. So this one simply has some children's play sand at the bottom, because that's quite a clean sediment. And then it has some old retrieved brick actually as well, to give another kind of elevation within it. And then simply, I think she was able to source one native pond plant, an oxygenator. So I think it was spiked milfoil. So that's in there as well, and that survived really well. So I got this last year, and my daughter and I put it into the little plot there, and we kind of decorated around it, put a few different logs and stones and little places for insects and all kinds of creatures to hide in around there. And I have to say, even though it's a really humble little pond, it's amazing the life that's there already. So even what I'll find is that certain certain bee species will come down, and wasps, and they'll drink from the edge. And then there's all kinds of little kind of single cell organisms there, like paramecium and stuff like that I see scooting around. And there's lots of other stuff going on. Like there was some mosquitoes in there, the mosquito larvae, and some people would balk at that and go, "Oh God, I don't want a pond because the mosquitoes." But actually, if you have a good wildlife garden, or at least have some, try your best in terms of that. And if there's hedgerows nearby and all that kind of side of things, even in the city, you'll find that bats will come and they'll help you with your insects that you don't particularly like. So I never worry about that. So I just want to give you a few examples of community, so larger ponds. So if you're interested in having a pond in your locality, but you don't know where to start, this is just an example of what you can do. So this is Paula Kearney here, this lovely smiley face person, who I think she's recently moved on, but she was the Galway City Biodiversity Officer. And here is one of the volunteers that was working with her. So Paula and I met as part of the An Taisce Ponds for Biodiversity project. And we had a meeting up in Merlin Woods in Galway. So this landscape is very much karst kind of landscape, which a lot of limestone. But what she noticed in Merlin Woods was that there wasn't really any surface water as such. So even for mammals and things to drink out of. And I think there had been a river, but it had been diverted and it had gone into a sinkhole. So there wasn't this source of fresh water and surface water that a lot of animals and plants thrive in. So she came to us, and we had a look. We had a look up, and we went and surveyed, and we came up with a plan. And then she took it from there, which is fantastic. So they created um, this kind of medium-sized pond. And so the middle picture there is the day it was dug. So ponds always look pretty rough when they're first created, and that's okay. And then within a year, so the second picture there to the right was only after a year. And at that stage, it was amazing. There was already aquatic mosses, charophytes, which are a group of green algae, and which the presence often indicates good water quality. They also found damselflies, dragonflies, demoiselle nymphs, all these different nymphs, the macroinvertebrates. Flag iris, you can just see at the forefront of there beside the rocks. Spike rush colonized as well. So they didn't plant it at all. This is what we like to say to people. It's hard to be patient, and as humans, it's kind of it opposes with our nature because we have relatively short lifespans, so we want to do things really quickly. But if you can wait and let things colonize naturally, generally, it's far better. And I'll go into that a little bit later. Here's another example of a pond that myself and Paula and the An Taisce team had a look at. So this is Quencentennial Park in Salthill in Galway. And you can what I'm showing you there is this lovely image of a sparrowhawk having a lovely bath in the side of the pond there. Now, when we first visited this pond, when Paula showed it to me, it was in dire straits because it had these concrete kind of little basin parts, little higher sections around the edges that hadn't been planted. And then in the middle part, it was just, I think there was a fountain, but nothing else. It was just green water. So Paula and I and the rest of the team had to think about it. And because it's an ornamental pond, which is okay too, but it's slightly different to a wildlife pond, but it can be both as well. So that for this kind of situation setup, oftentimes in community areas, people want to see open water. So what Paula decided was that she was going to plant the edges with a mixture of both native and ornamental water plants, and the ornamental ones, although they're not native, they were not alien invasives, so that she was very careful about that. And the reason why you see the sparrowhawk here, which you would definitely not have seen it bathing itself there before these measures had been taken, is because there's a bit of cover there now. And that's what wildlife needs often, a little bit of cover. Another example of a community pond that was created was as part of the An Taisce project, and in collaboration with LawPro, the local area waters program, and also with Green Spaces for Health and the Toher Community Garden group. So this it's a lovely site down in Cork City. It's called Clashville Park. So here we are at our first meeting. So it's the meeting between Green Spaces for Health, Cork City Biodiversity Officer, some of the volunteers at the community garden, Fran, one of our teammates from the Ponds for Biodiversity project. So the first thing we did was have a look at the surrounding landscape. And then we decided, okay, let's have a look and see if we do a test. We just kind of suggested to do a test pit to see if there was enough clay to hold surface water, to hold rainwater when creating this pond. And the volunteers got stuck in straight away. We discovered that there wasn't enough clay. So then we knew that a liner was required. It's always better if you have either the right water table, so there's enough water that will seep in, or if you've got clay that will seal in order to keep water within your pond. But if you can't, the next kind of one of the choices that you have is to use a pond liner. So this was a great collaboration, and everybody got involved on the day. So it took us one day from morning till evening to dig this community pond, and you can just see there was people of all ages, and you can see there's I think there's a 3-year-old in there at one point, and just getting stuck in. So it was a great community, event, and there was lots of food, there was lots of laughter, there was, it was just one of those things that it gives you joy, it brings joy. A lot of people had, so much input to it. There's such a pride of place, and you can see it's just gradually coming about as the clouds come over, which is useful because we needed some rain in there. And yeah, so we got the liner in. So we used EDPM, and then we also had a fleece. There was fleece on both sides of the EDPM, and that fleece can help to prevent, rocks and things like that from piercing your liner. And then put in a few barrels of water just to christen it. But yeah, again, a fantastic event. The great thing was, and I think this is really important, is that it's very hard, I think, sometimes for community groups to be able to create ponds in the community because of insurance issues and health and safety issues and things like that. But the great way to get around that happened in this partnership was that Rosemary, the biodiversity officer, she was able to secure some funding for this and also cover the insurance for this public space. And I think that is really, really important, because oftentimes community groups can't get that insurance. It's too expensive and it's not possible. So that's kind of one way around it. So yeah, collaboration is key. It always is, it always will be, and that's where conservation happens. So here's an example of a little kind of restoration project that we did. It was part of an An Taisce workshop, and we created, or we restored as best we could, this tiny little pond in Morehampton Grove up in Dublin. And when An Taisce came to me about this, they were kind of asking advice on what to do about this. And, so I gave a couple of options. One of them would be to pull out that liner. I think you can see on the left-hand side, there's this liner that had been stepped on, and there was a lot of liner. The light was getting onto the liner and degrading it. There's a forest school in this little nature reserve, so of course the kids want to be around it, and that makes perfect sense, and that's where they should be. But it meant that the liner had completely degraded, and there wasn't a kind of gradual stepped approach into the pond. So one of the options would have been to take out the liner and completely start again. Now there are invertebrates and things that are in there that their lives are important too. But so I guess that was one of the options. It would be more costly because they would have to get more liner, and there's other issues involved with that. So the second option I gave them was to just do what we could with what we had there. So using things that were already on the site, like logs and sticks and rocks and all that, create more habitat around the pond, take out some of the duckweed, which was, as you can see, it's very soupy on the left, so there's a bit of duckweed taken out, and then we were able to source some flag iris from somewhere nearby that we knew there wasn't any alien invasive species, so we were able to put some of that in as well. So there's I know it doesn't look perfect, and it's not going to be perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. And the image doesn't really do it justice. So it just goes to show you can make little changes, and sometimes that's all you can do. And yeah, so, and again, it was a really good learning experience for all of us, and sharing of local knowledge and wider. So that's so important, I think. And then you've got your fantastic big farmland ponds or your countryside ponds. So if you're lucky enough to have that kind of size of landholding, you can go mad with ponds. Just like wild acres, you can have your 67 ponds, but all different ages and stages and all the rest. So this is down in Wicklow, Paul Carberry's farm. And it's fantastic. You can see the vegetation cover, floating vegetation. You can see the marginal plants on the side. There's lovely semi-natural habitat nearby. He himself and his family happen to have the most unusual, really stunning calcareous grassland, which is unusual in Wicklow. So that's surrounding that pond, and there's a buffer zone where there's higher vegetation right at the pond, and then he's able to take cuttings and create hay and everything from the rest of the land. So if you're going to create a pond yourself, where do you start? So a couple of places. The Freshwater Habitats Trust in the UK are the rock stars of the wetland world, to be honest. They have been doing this for a very long time. They're international experts. So their website is just an amazing place that you can get lost in if you're interested in ponds. But here's a few things that, as you can see, the different fact sheets that they have. This is from the Million Ponds Project, but there's lots of other different projects that they've been doing over the years as well. And then in collaboration with them, they have a book called, I think it's called the Pond Book, actually, I've forgotten now, but they very generously let us use that and collaborate with them to create an Irish version, so the Irish Pond Manual. So that was something that we did together as part of the Ponds for Biodiversity project. So it's a little guide on how to create and manage ponds. So it's a good starting spot, I think, and there's lots of information in there. So of course, I would definitely recommend having a little look at that as well. So what do you do? What are the key considerations? First of all, in creating a wildlife pond, do no harm. So you don't want to be creating a wildlife pond in a special area of conservation or a special protected area or a natural heritage area or anything similar like that without permission from the NPWS. And when choosing the location, just try and make sure that you're not removing a good habitat that's already there. There's no sense in doing that, of course. Ponds should not interfere with existing natural watercourses like streams and rivers. So you don't want to connect your pond to a river or stream, and oftentimes I know it might seem counterintuitive not to do that, but the thing is, rivers and streams often have greater pollution issues, and they can bring in pollution to your pond. They can also bring in alien invasive species, and then you can have issues with that side of things. Don't plant your pond, if possible. Let it colonize naturally, especially if it's a wildlife pond and you're not talking about an ornamental pond. Water quality, in terms of water quality, cleaner is better. And situating your pond well away from sources of pollution and enrichment will be the greatest determinant of how clean that water is and what the water quality is like. Another thing is connectivity wise. So if you can connect your pond with other semi-natural habitats, that will deliver more for nature as well. So you're thinking hedgerows, species-rich grasslands, or even grasslands, riparian zones around rivers and streams, but not connecting. And actually, other wetlands would be fantastic as well, but not directly connecting those wetlands with your pond. Another thing is the structure of your pond. So we'll be having a look at some images of this, but generally shallow ponds are best for wildlife. So the first 10 to 30 centimeters are really important for plants and animals of ponds. You want gentle slopes and an undulating topography. And if possible, having a pond complex, especially if you've got more land rather than a single pond, is going to be better because there's going to be more diversity. So you'll have different ages and stages and sizes and things like that. Another great thing that you can do to add value to your pond is to use any excavated material. Say if you have clay and stones and log piles and stuff, use that to enhance around the pond. And you can be really creative with this. And I've even seen people use excavated material to help create nesting banks for sand martins. So yeah, lots to think about and lots of creative ways to use your excavated material. You can even make bee banks and stuff like that. So key considerations to remember: water quality, cleaner is better. Connect with other semi-natural habitats if possible. Structurally, have gentle slopes, undulating topography, a pond complex rather than a single pond, and use the excavated material for wildlife features. Another way that you can add clean rainwater to a pond, especially if it's in a garden and even in a farm sometimes, but if you have a downpipe from your roof, so that's bringing rainwater down, and you can bring that pipe to your pond if it's close enough. Or if you have a water butt, especially in a garden, that's something that you could top up your pond with if you wanted to. Here are just a few considerations as well. This is part of the Irish Pond Manual, just a few pre-site planning checks. So think about how you might impact different species and sites. If you're going to cut away trees and stuff like that, you want to do that at the right time of year. You don't want to be putting ponds necessarily in historic sites unless you have permission from local archaeologists, etc. And then there, goes on like that. So there's lots of information there. So yeah, when we talk about clean water ponds, we're talking about ponds that haven't been degraded by pollution. So that means that they don't have high levels of nitrates and phosphates and things like that. And that's again why we try to avoid linking ponds to drains or feeding them from rivers and streams. And actually, if you were to feed your pond from a river or stream, you need to get permission if you're going to do any in-river or in-stream works from Inland Fisheries Ireland. So it just complicates things. And there's no need, there's plenty of other ways we can do it. So you can see examples here. The top one is an example of, where there's linkages between the rivers and there's like not much vegetation around them. There's larger ponds, but it's better if you've got a variety like the bottom one. Yeah, so that's all something that's all important stuff to consider. His shape, like I was saying, it's great if you can have an irregular pond. Nature loves edges. It loves this transition between the water and the terrestrial dry land. And when you have edges, you've got greater edge effect. So you've got the more benefit of these different this topography. And oftentimes when people are making a pond, that it'll almost turn out looking like a pool, even if you don't want it to look like that. And that can happen for different reasons. So if, for example, you have a larger area and you're able to use a digger to dig out your pond, if you've got clay in particular, sometimes you need to drive over that base once you've dug it out in order to make the pond seal really well. And by doing that, sometimes it depends on the shape and everything. Sometimes it ends up that it's easier for the machine to create this shape. And I would say not to worry about that, because you can reprofile ponds just after that. You don't have to do it all in one go. It can be a staged process as well. So if it's too regular, you can start to bring in irregular edges and then different things around there, like your log piles, rock piles, all the rest. One of the things I would say is that in Ireland, the depth of a pond matters. And like I said, shallower ponds tend to be better for wildlife. But so in terms of the planning regulations, you can't have a pond that's more than 1 meter in depth without applying for planning permission. So that's another thing to just try and avoid, I would say. Then there's this drawdown zone, which is the area of the highest water down to the lowest water. It's better if you've got this wider drawdown zone, as you can see at the bottom. So you've got more little undulations, more microhabitats for plants. You've got different temperatures and stuff like that that are going on in these little microclimates. So that's going to be add to a greater diversity of wildlife. So the next kind of consideration is whether you need to line your pond or not. Ideally, you wouldn't need to line it. You would have a clay soil, or you'd have a high enough water table. But if you do need to line it, there's a few different options. So what you can do first is do your test pit and see how it fills over time. And there's sorry about the fuzzy image down here, but pond liners, like I said, that you have the butyl rubber ones that you can at the top there, and then the fleece lining protective layer as well. And you can sandwich those together if you have particularly rocky areas. So in terms of flexibility, the synthetic rubber ones can work well. I would avoid using plastic because of the way it breaks down the microplastics. You can also use bentonite clay. So bentonite clay is clay. It tends to be imported into Ireland, and that's the only thing. But it is a natural clay, and it can be sold a bit like cement in a kind of a particle or a powdered form. And that one can be a little bit trickier to use, or it can also be sold as part of what's called a geosynthetic clay liner, so GCL. So it's kind of sandwiched between some textiles. So you've got the mineral clay in between this kind of textile around it. And again, like I said, it's best to be patient and not plant up your pond, because you could very easily, unbeknownst to you, create a big issue by accidentally introducing something that is going to outcompete your native pond plants, or what you could also do is bring in diseases and fungi and all kinds of stuff. So it's much better not to plant up, and just try your best to be patient. It's amazing what will come in naturally. Either it will be in the bank already in the soil and waiting to emerge, or sometimes even water birds can bring in seeds and stuff on their legs. So here's an example of 2 different native pond plants. And as you can see, they're quite kind of subtle. Mostly it's a very specialist kind of area, these aquatic plants that are submerged. They can look very similar, and there can be ones that look the natives can look very similar, like not like non-natives. So it's best to kind of avoid this issue if you can. Few considerations here. So for pond management, if you're trying to manage shading from trees, so ponds are the most diverse ponds tend to be in areas that are less shaded. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with a shaded pond, but if that's your only pond, you're better off putting it somewhere that it's not as shady. But if you're going to manage trees around your pond, just remember that not to cut trees within the bird nesting season. In terms of managing vigorous growth of native plants, so you might have an awful lot of growth of plants on the surface of your pond, and you might want to decrease those a little bit. The recommendation is generally to use the rule of thirds, so only kind of get rid of a third at a time. And once you kind of you've raked off the plant that you want to remove, you can put it onto the edge of your pond for 24 to 48 hours to let any little insects and wildlife get back into the pond before you can compost it or anything like that. But just remember that what time of year you're doing it might impact certain species like amphibians. So especially during the breeding season in the springtime and into the early summer. When you're managing algae and duckweed, the only consideration there is that I guess duckweed and algae can take up nitrogen and phosphorus. However, they can need to be managed. So in an unpolluted pond, they don't always pose an issue. Nature can reach an equilibrium generally. However, when caused by eutrophication, like a big input of pollutants, this can be a problem. Then health and safety wise, so I think one of the biggest barriers to creating ponds, full stop, has to be health and safety, and it's understandable. I do get it. So there are risks of drowning. That's obviously the worst case scenario. Infection, and sometimes livestock getting caught in liners or bogged down in certain sediments. But I guess what I would say is there's a huge amount of safety measures that you can use in order to create a pond that is safe for everyone. And I'd also say as well that, the sea is something that it's not something we fence off, but we do teach our children and how to be safe around the sea. And also we would always accompany children or vulnerable adults when they're near the seaside. So it's if you think about it in that way, I know it can be slightly different, but we don't have to fear it as much as I think we do at the moment in Ireland. So some of the safety features that you can include around your pond is, of course, fencing and signage, so people know that there's going to be water there, there's going to be change in topography. You can also add a safety grid, especially if it's in a schoolyard or somewhere like that. They don't look very attractive, but they do the job. And sometimes if it means the case of either having a pond or not having a pond, it's probably better just to have the pond with the safety grid. Hand washing, simple kind of hygiene. Just wash your hands if you touch the pond water, and don't be rubbing it in your eyes, your mouth, or your cuts. So again, there's lots of these simple measures that we can include. Here's an example here of one of my colleagues, Rob Gandola, took. So this is in a pond that was created in one of the schools in Tala. And you can just see here on the left how it was excavated out, and then they've got this grid over it there. And you can I think the grids can go a little bit lower than the water sometimes, so that, of course, if a kid falls in, they'll just get a little bit damp, but they won't actually go in deep to the water. But I would always say that, a shallow water pond is better for wildlife anyway, so you can get around these things that way as well. So here's just a few examples of the different resources that we created as part of the Ponds for Biodiversity project. So we've got the Irish Pond Manual. There's a PDF of that available on the website. We also created a guide for local authorities. Just to keep it simple, I think it was about 14 pages, because local authorities already have enough on their plates. They don't want to be reading a 100-page document on how to create ponds in their locality. We also carried out a national pond survey report, which is really interesting, and it shows how people think about ponds, and it's actually a fascinating report, which you can kind of delve into yourself. One of the nicest kind of resources that were created in collaboration with the most amazing children's book illustrator, Brian Fitzgerald. are these pond pamphlets. So one's on the importance of ponds for wildlife, and the other is on how to create a pond and manage it for wildlife. And they're free to download and print from the website there. You can see how much Brian loves wildlife, because look at all these amazing creatures that he's depicted in here, that we kind of worked on this together as a team, and he just created the most amazing resource. So that's there, and it's there's something there for children and adults, I think. Same with this simple guide to creating and managing a pond for wildlife, um, expertly kind of illustrated by Brian again. So something that you can kind of pour over. It's nice to stick in your kid's bedroom or anything like that. Then if you've created a pond, like I said, why not monitor how the pond is doing for wildlife? There's lots of different monitoring schemes. One of them is the Dragonfly Ireland one, so that's monitoring dragonflies and damselflies. So that's something you can have a look at if you're interested in that. Another great way to kind of find out more about what's in your pond is to do little pond dips. And that's fantastic for all ages. I think I've never met a person who wasn't excited when they looked at what they had scooped out of the pond. It turns the most serious of adults into children again, which is absolutely phenomenal. So the Freshwater Habitats Trust have this very simple big pond dip, and it helps you to classify your ponds based on their macroinvertebrates. So how clean the ponds are, how well your ponds are doing for wildlife. So it uses different groups of macroinvertebrates. So some of the species will be very sensitive to pollution, and others will be more tolerant. And then they each get a certain score. So the higher scoring ones are the ones that are sensitive, and the lower scoring ones are the ones that are most tolerant to pollution. And so it gives you a good indication of where you're beginning, and it tells you whether your pond is good, could be better, good, or brilliant. So I think it's a great way to start. Always remember, though, that health and safety is also for wildlife. So when we're moving between water bodies, it's really important to check, clean, and dry your kit. So your clothing, your footwear, your nets, anything like that. Even the trays. So there's guidelines there, and that's particularly important, and it's important for anglers. It's important for anybody using any wetland environment. And just another thing to note, in terms of health and safety for wildlife, just be aware that if you have a dog, and you've recently put a flea treatment on it, that flea treatment is a pesticide. It's there to kill an invertebrate, an insect, the flea, and that can have a real big issue on pond life. So letting dogs into ponds, and I know it's hard because dogs love water, a lot of dogs do, but just be very aware of that, and the pollutant impact that it can have. Another survey is the Dobentons bat survey. It tends to be along rivers and streams, but actually mostly bigger rivers. But you can have a look into that on Bat Conservation Ireland. But even if you've got a larger pond, you might be more likely to get Dobentons bat. So it's worth getting out a bat detector if you have one, or borrowing one from your local bat group, and finding out if you've got Dobentons. In terms of species in general, you can record species in and around your pond and submit them to the National Biodiversity Data Centre, which is a great way to be a citizen scientist and to add a lot of value um, I guess, what we know exists in a certain place at a time, and how that might change over time. So some of our more common species, we might just think, oh, sure, they're common, but it's very easy for common species to become rare then. So it's something we have to think about. So that's really good and really worth doing. There are some fantastic national initiatives supporting wildlife ponds. So there's, for example, the Hare's Corner and Refarm Ireland, which are both kind of managed by Burn Bio Trust. So the Hare's Corner, landowners can apply for support to create wildlife ponds. So each year now there's different counties that are considered for this. This year I know Carlow and Wexford and different places like that, and Kilkenny, I believe, were the counties. So people could apply for funding and for support by a local ecologist or an ecologist. to create their wildlife pond. Reform Ireland, which I have been working with for about a year now, they have a really interesting model. So they're using so funding from corporates to channel into invest into farmers and help them deliver real ecological and social impact and deliver nature-friendly actions on their farm. There are different actions that were available. So there's the wildlife ponds, mixed species hedgerows, woodland copses, species-rich grassland management, and then a flexible choice, which is called the farmer's choice. And I had the privilege of managing the Wicklow pilot of this, which was based on wildlife ponds. So there was 12 farmers involved with that, and they created the most amazing ponds. The smallest, I think, was 170 meters squared, all the way up to 3,000 meters squared. So we're talking really big ponds here. So that's another that's something that's going to be scaled up. And I would say to everybody to keep an eye on that, because if you are a farmer or know a farmer who'd be interested in that, hopefully they will get the chance to get involved in that. The impact report for that is available on the Reform website as well. Another thing you can do is raise your voice. So get involved in public consultations. So you can add ponds and pond kind of plans into any of the county development plans or the local area plans, biodiversity action plans. So become a pond pusher. It's worth it, and your community will benefit from it hugely. What I'd also say to you is have a look at the biodiversity action plan. So there's a really good portal here, actionsforbiodiversity.ie, run by National Biodiversity Data Centre. And it's like an area where you can find all your different biodiversity action plans, and you can have a look at them yourself and see what's in there. Hopefully there'll be ponds or wetland creation or restoration in some of them. And there'll be new ones as well coming up. So you might have your chance to input into those. So keep an eye out for what the local biodiversity officers are doing across Ireland. I think a lot of them have created their new biodiversity action plans last year, but there'll probably be more coming as well. So that's always really good. And that's it. Hopefully I haven't gone over time too much. I think I have a bit, but thank you so much for listening. Thank you to An Taisce for inviting me to give this webinar. I'm absolutely delighted to be talking about ponds. I have some useful links and a list of these links and other useful resources will follow, as Valerie was saying, in an email to all of the attendees. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, we have our Q&A, so I just want to say thanks so much, Aoife. That was brilliant. There was so much there. So I think people can understand why there'll be a follow-up with the links and the video, because there's an awful lot of information. So thanks for people coming along. The recording will be shared along with the resource links, and you can always get in touch as well if you have queries. info@antaisce.org or membership@antaisce.org as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to turn off the video, and then I'm going to move through the questions. There are a lot of lively questions there, so we'll get through them, and they're great. So I'm stopping the recording. Here it goes. Stop.